And very similar to some of the Persian and some of the steppe axes, or even to Comanche war axes here on the plains in the US, they get their energy by taking a relatively light axe head, but a long handle. So they have a very long lever arm. It's a surprisingly delicate weapon. This looks very heavy, I'm sure, through the camera, but the axe head itself weighs no more than about 3/4 of a kilogram, and many of them down to as much as 1/3 of a kilogram. So you put that on the end of a meter-long stick, and you have a lot of acceleration, a lot of force.
Absolutely.
In fact, this one I once put through a breastplate that I didn't even mean to hit. I was walking through a room and I was irritated trying to get to my closet. So I swatted it out of the way and then picked it up, and I had axe embedded in breastplate. I felt very stupid. It was the last time I ever took a sharp edge and swung it at a breastplate without anger.
So you teach it as well, and this is a lineage which has been kept, correct?
That's correct. That's correct. My mentor Csaba still teaches in Hungary.
Does it have many techniques or different techniques, these axe techniques?
The axe techniques are relatively simple, except where they're really, really complicated. And I'm not trying to be cute with that. The basic techniques, anything you can do with a saber except for actions in the bind, you can do with an axe. All the same basic 6 cuts, thrusting with the head, swatting with it, because it's still a big lump of iron on the end of a stick, right? I don't have to hit someone in the knee to send him home and to have him stop bothering my daughter. A swat with the side of the axe will take care of that just fine, and we don't have to get anybody lifelong injuries. We can be nice to each other that way. Other techniques involve hooking and trapping the weapon, which is one of the most misunderstood things ever. All you have to do to trap with an axe is to swing it like it's a sword. You'll automatically hit and trap. So if I'm going to swing, and I'll use the spike for this end, I'm swinging a point through space. I have to aim that point through space. Well, if I swing this like it's a sword and I'm aiming to produce a cut, there's a travel down through the weapon. That's why we hit at what some people call the center of percussion on the weapon, right? And then as it goes into target, it winds up moving along the edge.
Yes.
If I do that with an axe and I swing like this, I wind up here, and then I've hooked it. If I swing it like it's a point, I hit with the point and I cleave, which is very amusing for me once a spring when I bring my students out to cut brush in my front yard and sometimes cut bamboo with an axe. And I know whether or not they've practiced based on whether they're hitting with this very narrow edge and cleaving through the bamboo, or whether the front of my axe haft is completely green at the end of the day because they've been swinging it like it's a sword rather than an axe.
That's right. Very good
Yeah.
comparison. And do you also teach the other ones you showed me? They were like cane or baton. What are these? Could you explain them to us?
Yes, well, Savant has a number of weapons inside of it because it was both military and civilian. So there's horsewhip, there's razor, because straight razors, in spite of their reputation, didn't shave well. And if you were a middle-class person in Paris in the 19th century, you had your razor with you because by 6 in the evening, you had to shave again. You no longer had a clean shave. Cane is very common. It's a stand-in for both a stick and the sword. The difference between the two is what you do on impact. With a cane, you'll try to hit with the edge, hitting hard targets. If you're using it as if it was a sword, as the school of Joinville did when they used these as cheap trainers for sabers, then you'll hit normally as if it's a sword. The wrist moulinets are very similar. Baton tends to be a little bit more complicated depending on your grip. I'll do a couple moulinets each style so you can see it. In the first section, you'll see that I'm holding the somewhat like you would hold a sword, and that's the Joinville military school. The second version will be what's called the Fédéral school. what you'll see with these is that the moulinets are not merely there to move the stick around, but they're also intended to deflect the opponent's incoming strike or weapon, creating what's called the covered rows, where you have simultaneous attack and defense. Very similar in some ways to what some people call the flashy or karate blocks, where they don't understand why there's these big flowery beginning motions. It's like, well, that's where you're trapping his wrist so you can go ahead and deliver your punch, right? The same thing's happening here. If I'm making this moulinet, I'm not simply getting the heavy stick in motion, although it's a factor if your stick is heavy. I'm also deflecting a blow and trying to find an angle where I can deliver my own safely. And very similar to the saber and to the Georgian swordplay, the systems themselves are relatively simple in that respect. The knife play I learned is rather different. It can be a little bit complicated. It's got a lot of Mexican lineage inside it, and it can get quite elaborate, but the stick and the cane that's purely French is very, very simplified.
Could you tell us about the knife play you learned?
Sure. So they called it sacatripas after a very common household knife from northern Mexico. It's a little curved edge knife like this. The edge is on the inside. It's just everybody has it. Your grandmother cut chicken necks with it kind of knife. But they would hold it in a reverse grip in this lineage for fighting. And the idea is that you pass a blow through so that you can defend yourself using body motion and by taking care of space around you. I'll step backwards and do a couple of basic techniques. So if a blow is coming in, I try to pass it. I see my body out to give myself space. And then from there, can either try to hook a leg, if this is very serious business. Hopefully I don't have a knife drawn if it's not very serious business, right? You also can attempt to cut through and fillet the bicep. So you have a very relatively simple mechanical motion that you're using as an almost universal guard. And then depending on the context, you can either cut with this end, cut with that bend, make a thrust, do various trapping motions or arm locking motions. You might be having a knife out or a little stick out and your uncle's gotten drunk and you don't really want to hurt him. So in that case, you might make the pass, but then clamp it to the arm, turn it, hold him down, let him do all the sobbing, drunken apologies that people who get violent after they've had too much alcohol tend to do. So whereas the military saber tends to be a very honorable lineage, savate stuff comes from middle-class life, and it has some really interesting cultural backgrounds to it that has things you wouldn't think about for swordplay, like how do you handle your drunken uncle with a sword? That doesn't make much sense, right? But you might have one of these other things around and need to engage in violence that's not for the sake of putting someone down in combat, but rather just getting through your day and minimizing the harm people are doing to each other. And in that respect, in savate, all kinds of little trickery type techniques are considered fair game because you're not trying to destroy the other person, you're trying to make sure everybody gets home. It's a less knightly perspective.
I have a question. So this Mexican knife fighting is not part of the savate you teach, right? Is it just to make sure?
No, it's part of it. And I learned it inside the lineage. So I learned through a Basque lineage that's taught on the Mexican border. I haven't been in contact with the instructor for some time because unfortunately savate tends to be riddled with politics. But that family lineage is a Basque lineage where many of its people were in northern Mexico and very southern Texas on the Laredo border. And it's the Buitron family, if you ever wanted to look them up. And they have a number of bits of Mexican technique that are very similar and interrelated. So there's savate, panache, chausson, all these related disciplines. They also have zapota, which is Basque. It tends to have less extended movements and a lot more little circular actions. So it's taught alongside.
Let's go back to savate. Could you tell us about the techniques of savate and what do techniques of savate compromise or have?
The techniques of savate have to be broken down into sporting versus not sporting, because when we say savate nowadays, what we usually mean technically is boxe-francaise or boxe-francaise savate. And it's a sporting style. You're kicking with the shoe. You're using all the shapes of the shoe. You're also punching while wearing gloves. It's a very upright style and uses various combinations of kicks and punches. And the kicks and punches are very restricted in what you do in order to keep the game safe. Very similar to how some karate and Eastern Asian fighting styles have a sporting branch that lets people have contests without worrying about crippling each other. That's what boxe-francaise serves as. The body is held very light, and there are three characteristic body motions on which techniques are built, and that's the pivot, the balance, and the piston. And so there will be various stomping kicks delivered with the foot this way, or even to the with heel inside and toes to the outside, although that's illegal in the ring. That will be various kinds of stomps, and there will be kicks with the equivalent to a roundhouse that will come in on a slightly different angle because you're roundhouse kicking with the toe. Whereas a tie kicker or most karate type styles delivering a roundhouse will be going for heavy impact. The savateur instead wants to land with the toe and deliver force into the body. So they'll target the liver, the spleen, the kidney, the stomach. During a friendly bout, of course, you're not supposed to kick with the toe itself, but with the instep so that there's an impact, but not one that could potentially give you real harm. Legal hand techniques are restricted to standard boxing blows, so you won't have some of the more interesting boxing punches like a gancho or a swing or some of the various older school boxing strikes that are known, but generally not considered ring legal. You might see them in an MMA fight. For example, in an MMA fight, you would see an over-right delivered very commonly. You would not see that in a standard boxing match because it's considered dangerous boxing. It's too likely to target back through here. And modern boxing's come up with those rules because they were getting too many people killed. So there's a strong argument for having those safety features. Since I'm not throwing people into the ring, what I've tended to do is to work a lot of the older techniques in that blur the line between kicking and grappling. Old school savateurs also tended to be wrestlers, and some of them even cross-trained in judo. And it was considered very normal for a wrestler to also be a savateurs and back and forth. And we have old school techniques called panache that are about blending the two in interesting ways for survival in the street. I can give you an example of one if you'd like to see it.
Yes, please.
Okay, so everyone who's done martial arts for a while is familiar with the concept of an arm bar, right? Okay, so I'll demonstrate an arm bar delivered in a way a saboteur might. So when the incoming blow is caught, it can be taken at the elbow. If this is something friendly where you don't want to do someone harm, and you can roll them into an arm bar, or it can be taken above the arm in order to dislocate the elbow. If this is someone you don't know and you need to end the fight as quickly and humanely as possible. Because a dislocated elbow is not going to threaten anyone's life. It's going to send them home and have them not starting fights with anybody for a while, right? Sure. Unfortunately, drunken people who start fights for no reason is very much a part of modern society. Along the way, you can also use that as a control and deliver attacks with the feet at the same time to destroy their structure. You can do stomping attacks to the legs, kicking attacks to the torso while maintaining that structure, or I'll set it up for a throw. I forget the judo term for it. The American wrestling term would be a side fall. It's a very commonly used throw for savate. Very old school savate panache also had a curious limitation. Legally, if you struck someone in the face with a closed fist, the consequences for doing so were much, much higher than if you used an open hand. So a lot of the older school techniques are also designed to sort of look as if you're not actually fighting. But, oh, they got hurt and it was an accident, and that way you didn't get arrested and thrown into the Foreign Legion for punching people in the face.
Yeah, that's right. And do you use, in Savant sportive version, do you use hooks and uppercuts, like in boxing?
Yes,
Okay. But
both are used.
do they use back fists?
Do not use back fists so much.
Okay.
The angles just, it's known, it's legal, but there's no, it's not no, that's the wrong word. A back fist tends to have less use given the geometry of the legs that are also in play. So if you're throwing hooks, especially since hook today is synonymous with short hook rather than long hook.
Exactly.
Most of the short hooks that are thrown are happening when you've gotten in closer than you want to be. Someone has thrown a kick and it's been evaded, they've stepped in too close or something like that. When you're at that distance in savate, you're still in very great danger of getting kicked in the legs because there's more space there. So the back fist tends to be a little bit less useful. Unofficially, a gancho or a short rising uppercut similar to a shovel hook are thrown, but in those cases, usually in the sportive version, what's happening is the referee is separating the two people.
Okay. And is it allowed to use, like we do in Kyokushin and Muay Thai, the shin kicks?
It is allowed, but very rarely thrown because we use a shoe. There's relatively less utility in using the shins themselves, and the way we generate power doesn't make them as useful. So, for example, we don't use the shin to block either so much as trying to hook the kicks. I'll give you an example. So a Kyokushin or a Thai person defending against a kick might raise like this and then allow that energy to bleed off this way. Or if they've really conditioned the heck out of their legs, just make it a hard block with the shin, right?
Right.
So a block patrel, for example, would take the same kick coming in and hook it this way and pull it so as to then allow an immediate response to the inside after breaking someone's balance. The shin itself is not typically considered a weapon in savate-boxe-francaise.
What about elbows?
Elbows are strictly illegal as long as the referee is watching.
Okay. And the knees? Can you use the knees?
Not in ring legal fights.
No. I'm talking about a sportive version, of course, not self-defense. You cannot use the knees in sport. Okay.
Right. You can't use the knees in sport. Knees and elbows are thrown all the time in the self-defense versions. They're very popular. As well as the shoulder.
Are throws allowed in the sport version to throw some?
Throws are strictly forbidden in the sport version. So the sport version is strictly striking and often limited impact because French martial arts tends to put a premium on control and on your demonstrated ability in terms of managing the space and angles and geometry of the fight. So it's not going to tend to be very heavy impacts, but a case of who controls the distance and angulation and demonstrates that they can land the blows over and over again on a consistent basis against the opponent. So but the mindset, go ahead.
They can knock each other out, right? This is
they absolutely can. They can throw a heavier blow that winds up breaking an arm. Those sort of things happen all the time. Knockouts are taken for granted.
Okay.
So there are different levels of impact that are specified within the sport, and some are light impact, some are full impact, and it depends on the style of the competition.
And do they have weight categories in savate? Different way?
I no longer know whether that has come to pass or not. When I was training, there was no weight category. So you could have a very lightweight fighter and a very heavyweight fighter. And when you had a matchup like that, you tended to see the competition restricted to lower levels of impact. But I know of bouts we've had where, not my generation, but the previous generation before, relatively small guys were going up against bigger guys in full contact bouts. And that wasn't considered unusual at all. Much like judo does, savate has techniques that work very well for big guys and techniques that work very well for little guys or little gals, because women fighting is very much a thing in savate.
Okay, very good. And tell us a bit more about the self-defense aspects of savate and what do you do in there?